Chinese jets have locked target tracking radar on Japanese fighter jets. What seems harmless is actually a major provocation that didn't escalate only due to Japanese self-restraint. Why this is the case, how China has acted similarly before, and how it relates to rising geopolitical tensions. All of that here in this video. Holy moly, now save the most at Holy with my code. Media reports say Chinese J-15 jets from the Liaoning carrier twice targeted Japanese F-15S with their tracking radar. China stated that exercises occurred east of the Miyako Strait, likely in international waters and also in Japan's exclusive economic and air defense identification zones. Exercises are generally legal there. But China says that Japan provocatively interfered with the exercises, and that's why the fire control radar was activated. Fighter jet. There are 3 radar modes here, which we'll explain using a soldier as an example for clarity. The search mode is the first mode. Here, the radar sends out scattered pulses to monitor the airspace. With classic radar devices, this is the rotating antenna, which detects the object once per rotation and thus records a new position every few seconds. This provides an overview of who is where and in which direction they are moving. This is standard practice, mainly for collision avoidance, as collisions can occur even without military involvement. So we can picture this as the soldier carrying his weapon slung over his shoulder, looking around attentively. He is armed, yes, and he shows that he is alert. But he also shows that he is not looking for a fight, and at the same time it will be hard to surprise him. The tracking mode is the next mode. In this mode, the radar begins to continuously measure the target. The flight direction, speed, altitude, and course changes are tracked precisely. A fighter jet with its sensors can detect the acquisition and knows that it has been detected by the radar station as a relevant object and that it is now being closely monitored. The radar's resolution isn't meant for weapon systems. So that's the soldier who has taken his rifle off his shoulder and is holding it in both hands. We usually call that low ready, but the rifle is pointed slightly downward, not even necessarily in the general direction of another person. But by doing that, he shows that he's ready to fight if necessary, but he's not a threat himself. In Firelight radar mode, on the other hand, the situation is completely different. Here, an extremely focused beam is generated that continuously calculates and tracks the exact position in real time. The radar resolution is precise enough to allow for an immediate missile launch. Missiles on a fighter jet, such as PL-12 or PL-15, constantly receive radar data, allowing for immediate launch without extra preparation. So that's the soldier who aims his weapon at the person and switches the safety of the rifle to fire. Now all it takes is a pull of the trigger to shoot. And that's how the fire control radar lock should be understood. Locking on with the fire control radar is a pursuit that is no longer just a threat. It is the final phase before opening fire, even in military terms. Locking on is seen as a major escalation just below war, carrying a real risk of a shot being fired. The pilots have to respond as if an attack is imminent, even in peacetime, because it can happen unexpectedly at any time. So evasive maneuvers have to be flown and command has to be informed. If necessary, the National Air Command has to deploy reinforcements to send help to their own aircraft. This ensures they're not left alone during an attack, which can happen anytime. If this aircraft is illuminated by the fire control radar lock that is targeted by the fire control radar, it is under immediate threat. Disputes between states are common, especially between China and its neighbors over territorial claims. Normally, radio messages are then sent on the international emergency frequency in which a warning is issued or in which there is a request to keep a distance. Turning on the fire control radar is not a communication signal, but rather a military action. That's why it's seen as a highly dangerous act worldwide. As I said, it's like a soldier aiming his weapon with the safety off at a soldier from another nation. Even in peacetime, this can cause the threatened soldier to open fire in order not to become a victim himself. It's not fundamentally different for airplanes and ships, and this isn't the first time since this behavior isn't new. In 2013, a Chinese warship locked its fire control radar on a Japanese warship. Media reports say the ships were only 3 kilometers apart at that time. If the Chinese ship had opened fire, the Japanese ship would have had no chance to return fire before being hit. So the correct response from the Japanese side would have been to also lock their own fire control radar onto the Chinese ship and prepare to fire, so that in the event of the Chinese opening fire, they could at least launch their own weapons and retaliate before being hit. If the Japanese had responded in this way, the Chinese ship would also have felt mortally threatened and might have opened fire, since it could suddenly have seen itself as being in mortal danger. Here, the soldier who is being threatened by a stranger would have seen how the stranger takes the rifle off his own shoulder, loads it, and raises it to aim as well. In this situation, it's natural to fire before you're threatened. At that time, Captain Kiaputin kept a cool head and refrained from activating his own radar. He exposed himself and his crew to a possible attack back then, but in doing so he prevented the possible outbreak of a war. China denied it then, just as they're now trying to downplay it again. Just like in numerous other cases, such as the ramming attack on a Philippine ship that was discussed a while ago. These are gray zone warfare tactics that China has used all along. I became aware of the topic through Ground News, where I checked in the morning and found it here in the daily briefing. We have an artificial intelligence summary here of what happened there, where they specifically mention what all the different media outlets can agree on, so we most likely have a correct version here. All of this with artificial intelligence, but we can also take a look at how each topic was reported on individually. If we look at the articles that are reporting on this, we see that they are more or less balanced from the left and the right. We can see, for example, that an Indian media outlet exaggerated the situation, claiming it could have led to war. It clearly has mixed accuracy and reliability. Ground News helps me with this. It shows me both the media's factual reliability and their political leanings or ownership. And that's especially important with state media, of course. Here we have 9% state media, because a nation allied with China will report on such a topic differently than one that's, for example, allied with Japan. So Ground News helps me understand the background here, and especially with topics that take place in regions of the world where we don't really deal with them much. Of course, we don't know as much. The media doesn't know how reliable some sources are, but Ground News helps by showing me the facts more accurately. It also shows how differently the right and left report on topics. We can look at the blind spot here too. It's not directly related, but if they do. Normally, you mostly read media within your own political spectrum. That means, if you lean more to the right politically, you won't come across these media here. The political left misses out on these two outlets. That's why Ground News has the blind spot feature, so we can make sure we don't stay trapped in an ideological bubble. I've been using Ground News myself for, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years or longer. I have no idea anymore. I've been using it for ages. Torsten Heinrich has the Vantage plan, which I use to prevent these bubbles. For me, Ground News fits this channel perfectly because I also try to look at different sources from all directions. And if you want to use it as well, then use the link in the description. That will save you 40% on the Vantage plan. You'll also support the channel. Now back to the video. China makes massive territorial claims around its territory. This includes both Taiwan and the South China Sea. In the so-called 9-dash line, where it tries to take territory from the states there, it also claims the Japanese island group of the Senkaku Islands. And that's where the incident with the two warships I just mentioned took place in 2013. Recently, Chinese state media, which wouldn't publish anything that the Communist Party disapproves of so it roughly reflects their policies, have also been reporting on this. Recently, Japanese sovereignty over the Ryukyu Islands has also been disputed there. Part of these islands is Okinawa, which hosts large United States military bases. China wants to drive out countries from territories it claims, ideally without war. That's how it has to be understood. This means more pressure should be put on these countries to make them withdraw, allowing the territory to be taken without war. The Chinese strategist Sun Tzu wrote 2,500 years ago, "To defeat the enemy without fighting is the highest art of war." Chinese grey zone warfare must be understood in this context. With its aggressive behavior, China threatens other countries, in our example now Japan. If Japan responds adequately, it could trigger a war, but since Japan wants to avoid war, it has to make a decision. Either expose personnel and equipment to the threats, simply endure being targeted by a fire control radar, even though, as just described, this is an enormous threat. But it must find ways to avoid this. The clear solution is to maintain distance, even within your own economic zone, air identification zone, or territorial waters. such as the Senkaku Islands. If Zhongguo manages to make Japanese troops avoid confrontation in order to prevent escalation, then it pushes Japan out of its own territory and thus erodes Japan's sovereignty. To avoid a confrontation with the schoolyard bully, I like to work with metaphors. So, to avoid confrontation with the schoolyard bully, Japan is supposed to be pushed to lock itself in the bathroom during recess. There's also another purpose behind all of this. Of course, it's also meant as a sign of strength to the domestic audience. Our military's forceful actions also help politically at home. It's no coincidence this is all happening now. Japan's Prime Minister just said that Japan would also stand by Taiwan if a Chinese invasion were to threaten. International reactions were as expected. Japan protested and increased its military presence. So it doesn't want to lock itself in the school bathroom. The United States and others strongly criticized the behavior, while China claims it was a response to Japanese provocations. If we look at the whole thing from a military strategic perspective, we have to say there is a risk of unintended escalation here. Japan's military is being provoked and threatened. It might feel forced to fire in self-defense. Because, as I said, the fire control radar is the last stage before actually opening fire, so it creates a risk of an escalating spiral. Japan itself should respond confidently so as not to be pushed out of its own territory, which in this context means also activating its own fire control radar. But that in turn could trigger the Chinese to open fire, and that could then lead to a major war, which Japan naturally wants to avoid. China's overall risk tolerance continues to rise steadily. We've discussed this several times on the channel and will keep covering it. We need to understand that China is using these methods to intimidate neighboring countries and force them to give up their claims in order to avoid confrontation, so that China can then take over the territory. Because the moment Japanese ships, for example, avoid the area around the Senkaku Islands, the Chinese can land troops there. They can send personnel, raise their flag, and claim the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu Islands to China, are ours and always have been. What does China want here? They're doing the same in the South China Sea. If we come to a conclusion, this is the step toward a long-term risk dynamic. The incident fits a pattern of constant border testing by China, whether in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, or against Japan. Japan is responding more decisively, backed by the United States, because they rely on the United States. It is necessary to respond firmly to this, but at the same time, of course, it means an increasing risk. Because if you respond to an aggressor with your own self-confidence, it can make the aggressor act. But it can also make him want to show the other person that he is stronger in the house. Again, to use the metaphor. Global concern is rising about the growing risk of an incident. And with every action of this kind by the Chinese, there's a new chance that something could be triggered that wasn't planned, and that it could lead to an open exchange of blows. Deaths could occur on both sides if one provoked nation reacts too harshly, resulting in fatalities. The main question is, when does routine become a crisis? If you want to stay informed about such topics, then subscribe to the channel, and if you want to get information without bubbles, then use Ground News. With my link, you save 40% on the Vantage plan, which I use myself, and at the same time you support the channel. Of course, that's it for now. Thank you for your attention. See you soon. At this point, my heartfelt thanks also go to the supporters, especially to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Kamp and to Lieutenant Jans van Eck. Uwe de Vren, nickname Tulbib, Karsten Schulz, Gulaschnascher 4, 1000 Tequila, 42, Badass Lawyer Vision, Soundlab, P, K, If1, Wu, Mahamori, Robert Veal, 1528, Beertainment, Janis Gui, Antics, Sasha Muller, Cunningham, and Eustress. Many heartfelt thanks. Without them, it wouldn't be possible like this.